Dumu, staying at an inn. Staying at the inn alone, no friends, no one to share my mournful thoughts. Under a cold lamp, I think about my life. The cries of a lost goose wake me from sad sleep. In my dream, I travelled far, almost home by dawn. When my family sends letters, they take a year to find me. Outside, on the darkened river, the moon in mist, still tethered by the gate, a fisherman's boat. So, this is the first poem by Dumu in the collection of the 300 Town Poems. Dumu is a quite important poet. He makes it in the top, that's probably the top 10 in poets by number of poems, and he has 10 in this anthology. First contribution, a relative latecomer. We're halfway through the anthology, but it makes sense because Dumu's reputation is based on his quatrains, and we haven't reached that section of the anthology yet. So quatrains, we will see that later on. They are like half of a regulated poem, whether the regulated poem is pentasyllabic or heptasyllabic. So we have pentasyllabic or heptasyllabic quatrains, the trechu. Okay, Dumu. So who is Dumu? Brief introduction. As I said, he has 10 poems in this anthology as a whole, which is quite a lot. So Dumu is one of the most representative poets of the late Tang period. The late Tang period is generally the one that goes from, let's say, 825, 830. Some people put the starting date in 835 because of the Sweet Dew incident. But anyway, from the end of, the beginning of the second quarter of the 9th century until the end of the 9th century, which is when the dynasty collapses. It's a period of upheaval and decadence. After the relatively short-lived Yuan He restoration under the reign of Emperor Xian, the dynasty, which had been mortally wounded by the Anlushan rebellion, manages to make a bit of a comeback. Central government recovers part of its authority. It manages to establish alternative sources of taxation. The empire is not aggressively expansive, but it maintains a relatively high level of prosperity and stability until the end of the Yuan He period, until the 830s, let's say. From then onwards, the empire is going on an accelerated decline. It's going downward in a big slope for a variety of reasons. Some of them are, more ephemeral, you could say. So there is more infighting at the court. There is a succession of weak rulers, which are mostly the puppets of important figures of the court. There is the rise of the eunuchs. The eunuchs had started to become important in the mid-Tang period, and they controlled some emperors, and they had an informal control of one of the biggest standing armies in the empire, the Shanzi army. In 835, they managed to decapitate a conspiracy against them, and they managed to accrue even greater power. There's also a big episode of factional infighting in the court among the scholar officials, with basically two factions that are at each other's throats, the Li and the Niu factions. And that evidently has negative effects on the bureaucracy because, we have continuous vendettas and purges of the other members of the faction when the other faction manages to make it into power. Now, besides these small problems, there are more long-term problems that happen to all dynasties in the long run. Taxation is too heavy. A series of military pressures and natural disasters also come about, earthquakes and different other disasters. There's floods, there's crop failures. These things happen from time to time, and but in a context in which the government is imposing ever greater taxation, and they lead to a cycle, or not a virtuous cycle, the opposite, in which the situation gets worse and worse. Many peasants run away and stop paying taxes. They become bandits. Massive peasant rebellions take place. Peasant rebellions create a cycle of their own. They force higher taxation and the mobilization of armies to repress those peasant revolts. The situation becomes worse, the revolts become bigger, the armies controlling the revolts become more powerful and therefore sap power from the central government, and in the end, the warlords in charge of the armies finally end up carving the empire into pieces for themselves. So this is the decadence, the process that it's taking place during the late Tang. It's a slow process. It still takes about, almost a century, 70-something years to culminate. And things really only start getting really bad after the massive Huangchao rebellion, which takes place, I think, in the last quarter, like maybe from the 860s onward, or the 870s. So in this period is the period where Du Mu lives. The empire is still relatively powerful and wealthy, but it's becoming more and more corrupt, and the writing is in the wall for all to see that the empire is in decline, and that in a not too distant future, unless radical changes take place, the empire is going to collapse. Writers who wrote in the late Tang period generally have, more than in any other previous periods, sad, melancholy topics, especially of the type of good government is not sponsored and merit is not rewarded properly. And this is related to the courtly factions and struggles that we were talking about, the rise of Yunich power and the fight between the Li and Niu factions. As I said, there are two poets who are the most important late Tang poets, which are Du Mu, the one that occupies us here today, and Li Shangjing. They're generally grouped together as the little Du and the little Li, in parallel to the big Mu and the big Du and the big Li, which would be Du Fu and Li Bai of the High Tang. So Du Mu was a relatively moderately successful scholar official. He came from a very important family. He was born, I think, around 800 and something, 803 or so. Passed the examinations relatively early, in 827 or so, and lived until the 850s. Now, Du Mu came from a relatively good family. He passed different meritorious examinations, very interested in history, so a lot of his poems are about history. It's not the case here, but others are. He occupied a lot of mid-low level positions, prefect of small prefectures, minor posts in the central government, and he was very frustrated at his lack of success, in spite of his relatively high merit. And this is generally ascribed at the fact that he had been a protege of a member of the Niu faction in his youth. I mean, Niu Sengru, the leader of this faction, had appointed him chief secretary in 833. So when the Li faction got into power, they managed to block any rise to any important position for him. Okie dokie, so having given this background of the late Tang period and Du Mu, let's go on with this couplet, which I think matches the expectations or the topics of this era. Not too strictly, but it does match them in the idea of the lonely, meritful scholar official. So we have the protagonist, who is Du Fu's poetic persona staying at an inn. The topic really here is loneliness, traveling loneliness. So the poetic persona is far from home. The poem emphasizes, hammers in the distance from home. It doesn't clearly explain what the poet is doing. He's probably serving in some capacity in the administration in a place far from home. Maybe he's traveling to a new posting or something. But the emphasis is loneliness, the loneliness of the traveler. Remember, traveling poems in China, they're never happy. There's no pleasure, there's no wanderlust, there's no pleasure in going to other places. It's always a horrible litany of lamentations at being far from home and at being far from loved ones and from the people who might know and respect one, like other scholar officials. And this is the main topic of this poem. Okay then, let's go as usual couplet by couplet. Staying at the inn, alone, no friends, no one to share my mournful thoughts. So the first couplet resonates with the title. It just recapitulates the main idea of the poem. So the poet is at an inn, he is alone, he cannot share his thoughts with anybody. Remember, the scholar official class is very social, and poetry writing for the most part is a social activity in which you are with other scholar officials exchanging thoughts. not being with them, being alone, is always a very, very sad state of mind. There's no liking for introspection, as in Western Romantic poetry, at the pleasures of being alone. For the most part, in most poems, being alone, not being able to share one's thoughts, is a little tragedy. So the poem starts by setting us in a scene and in a mood. The poet is alone in an inn, so he's not in his house, or he's displaced in a temporary lodging, and he is alone. He cannot share his thoughts or ideas with anybody else. And this temporary, ephemeral loneliness is probably meant to be read more globally as the poetic persona, the scholar's loneliness in the world as such. His merit is not recognized. He is alone. He is serving in faraway posts. He is not among those whom he should be. He is not given the merit he thinks he deserves. Second couplet. Under a cold lamp, I think about my life. The cries of a lost goose wake me from sad sleep. So the second couplet gives us some more descriptive elements, some more background of the poet at the inn. Basically, two images are presented. A cold lamp, which is illuminating at night the room where the poet is sleeping, and a sound. So very, very typical in parallelistic couplets, a visual versus an oral, an auditory image. So the visual image is the cold lamp. The auditory image is the lost goose, a cry of a lost goose. Also the adjectives cold lamp, lost goose, cold and lost probably also are references to how Du Mu is feeling, and not only how he is feeling physically, but how he is feeling psychologically. So under a cold lamp, so not much visibility, not much light, we're in the darkness. He thinks about his life. Remember the tone of the poem, he was having mournful thoughts, so he is thinking, the thoughts he is having under the lamp are mournful thoughts about his life, probably about his failure to attain high office. And the cries of a lost goose wake him from a sad sleep. So look at the adjectives. I insist: mournful, cold, lost, sad. There's the melancholy, sad, pessimistic tone of a Chinese classical poem. He was awake, but then he fell asleep, and while he was asleep, he was woken up by a goose. So the goose probably indicates autumn. It could be spring, but it's probably an indicator of autumn, which again creates a background of sadness. Remember, autumn is the melancholy season. And he wakes from a sad sleep. The next couplet is going to describe us what he was dreaming about, and also manages to bring the point in, not only of the sad thoughts of the traveler, but of his distance from home. That is the topic of the third couplet, really. Distant from his roots. In my dream, I traveled far, almost home by dawn. When my family sends letters, they take a year to find me. So the poet is so far away from his home that even when he dreams, Chinese in the classical period believed that in your dreams you could travel to a loved one, you could travel to your home if you were homesick. But no, the distance from home is so big that even after dreaming all night, he hadn't yet reached his home. There's by dawn, traveling as fast as one can travel in a dream, he had only just managed to make it to his home before waking up and not being able to properly visit. And in the real realm, outside of the dream realm, the extension of this distance is emphasized by the fact that a letter from his family takes a whole year to reach here. Probably a bit hyperbolic, but it really pushes the point that the poet is very far away from his family and from his roots. Okay, finally the last couplet. Generally the last couplet summarizes and concludes the discourse of the poem, but in this last couplet I don't get a very clear summary of the rest of the poem. In fact, we get two further images which seem to point somewhere else, but they don't clearly seem, in my view, to summarize the rest of the poem. Outside, on the darkened river, the moon in mist, still tethered by the gate, a fisherman's boat. So we get a description of it's morning now at the inn. Probably Du Mu is going to travel further on. And there are two images outside the inn that he describes for us. The first image is of a dark river surrounded by mist. So the sunlight still hasn't really managed to clear the scene, and there's a moon hidden by mist, a dawn moon, which is a sad, melancholy sight, also associated with autumn, by the way. And that's in the heavens. Well, the river, well, not necessarily in the heavens, because the river is outside, we might imagine. The moon is up. And still tethered by the gate, a fisherman's boat. So at the gate of the inn, there is a fisherman's boat that is tied there. So I imagine we're not meant to just interpret these images as purely descriptive, as things that Du Mu says. And I would venture an interpretation of both images. The first one, of the darkened river and the moon in the mist, is probably an image meant to connect with Du Mu's own description of his loneliness and his plight. He is like the moon. He is hidden by the mists, next to a darkened river. The darkened river is the present, the life of chaos and decline of the dynasty, and of the lack of success of Du Mu. So I can see this very clearly or I could read it very easily as this sort of an image. Just like the moon, which is about to go out at dawn, hidden by mist and over a darkened river, so Du Mu is a traveling moon moving around, hidden by his lack of success in the world and in spite of his merit. And the fisherman's boat that is tied in connects to probably images that we've already talked a lot about, of retirement, probably of Du Mu's wish to leave the rat race, to quit this very unproductive desire of his to serve in office, and just to leave it all aside and lead the retired life, as many Scor officials always say they would like to do when their merit is not recognized, or when a bad government is taking place. The fisherman, this connects to, we've talked about it a lot of times before, to a text called The Fisherman, which is included in the anthology Chuzhu by Chu Yuan and others. The fisherman is a symbol for the simple retired life, and for the person, including the Scor official, who is wise enough in troubled times to leave office and to dedicate himself to individual pursuits. So, quite an interesting poem. You have to read a lot between the lines, and I think this is typical of Tang poetry in general, but it's all the more so with late Tang poetry, which becomes more baroque, if you will. Maybe not so much in Du Mu, very clearly in the other poet we haven't encountered yet, in Li Shangjing, which we will encounter in 3 or 4 poems' time. Images become darker, allegory becomes more subtle. There's a baroque tendency to the poetry in general.